Okay, we'll just give it another minute or so, just until we do have a couple more attendees coming in, and then we will start. Just give it another minute. I hope everybody's doing really well today, and it's nice and sunny and a little bit of snow here as well. Okay, what we will do to start off, this is a webinar on the PAS 2060, the journey to carbon neutrality, and it's conducted by myself, Clare Braham, and I'm a regional assessor with NQA. Just to explain a little bit about NQA, we are the world leading certification body. We are America's #1 certification body in the aerospace sector. We're top 3 in the UK for the ISO 9001, ISO 14001, obviously the ISO 45001 and the ISO 27001. We're also China's #1 certification body in the automotive sector. We're a global #1 certification body in telecommunications and the automotive sector. We're global #3 certification body in the aerospace sector, and we're UK's #2 certification body in the aerospace sector. So NQA specialises in high technology and engineering sectors. Can everybody hear me? I've just had a question that there's no sound. Can everybody else hear me? If you just want to pop a question just to let me know within the question box. Yeah, that's okay. Everybody else I think can hear me. That's great. Thank you. Okay, so just a little bit as well about NQA and all the certification and training services we do. We obviously look after the quality. We look after aerospace quality as well, automotive quality, the environment standard, the energy, health and safety, the information resilience, the food safety, the risk management, and also medical devices. So that's all the certifications that NQA do, and we'll look as well. I obviously do a number of those certification areas as well as a regional assessor. Again, a couple of the clients that NQA audit is Virgin Media, the Costa, so quite broad ranging, high profile, Vodafone, Boeing. I mean, you know, the names are there, high profile, that we all certify within NQA. Myself, Clare Braham, as you can tell by my accent, I'm from Northern Ireland, so apologise to anybody who can't understand me. I will try and speak that a little bit slower. I'm an auditor and have been for the last 7.5 years with the certification body, and I'm obviously with NQA, and I look after IMS systems. So I look after, I'm a regional assessor for the ISO 9001 standard, 14001 standard, and also the 45001 standard. Primarily, my background has been in engineering, but Northern Ireland is very small, and we do always go into different sectors within Northern Ireland. So my background, although I've been in engineering, I also do the food industry, service industry, water industry, and I've worked for many years since leaving college. How did I get into PAS 2060? Last year in January 2020, I decided I would go back to college and I would do a postgrad cert in zero carbon engineering. So my last time I had left, I'd actually done mechanical engineering as my master's at Queen's University in Belfast, and it was in 1988. Surprising to say, I did graduate from it, so I went back because I knew technology had changed, and I graduated last summer, and much to the dismay, I think, of my family again, I'm back doing another one in hydrogen technologies, and this focuses on different technologies but also looking at green hydrogen. So much has actually changed that we're looking at different technologies, especially from an engineering perspective. I am a lead assessor and also a trainer to the PAS 2060 standard. So I'm one of the lead assessors within NQA for doing a verification of the PAS 2060 standard. This webinar is approximately 45 minutes. You can ask any questions within the chat box. Questions and answers will be done at the end, and the recording of this webinar will be circulated shortly after it finishes today. So the webinar, the learning objectives is: what is carbon neutrality? The PAS 2060 approach, the basic principle of PAS 2060, the 4 key stages within it, and again, any questions will be answered at the end of it. So I think the buzzword going around is in relation to carbon neutrality. I think it's in every sector we go to, it is very much the buzzword, and even on media, television, etc. There's a lot of mentions in relation to carbon neutrality. We also want to get an understanding of what is meant by carbon neutrality, a background to carbon reduction, the development of PAS 2060, what are the benefits of having PAS 2060, and we will explain the different scopes of carbon emissions and the 4 stages of the process of the PAS 2060 in relation to the standard itself. So we will go through these in a high level detail within this webinar. So carbon neutrality, I think the first element is to define the definition of what is carbon neutrality, because there is a lot of confusion and a lot of different meanings and terminologies that you hear in the public domain just in relation to it. So carbon neutrality is a state of balance between the CO2 emitted into the atmosphere and the CO2 removed from the atmosphere. So we're always looking to see your carbon dioxide, which is emitted into it, and the carbon dioxide which is removed from the atmosphere. Zero carbon is that there is no carbon emissions are being produced. Carbon negative is a reduction of the carbon footprint to less than neutral, so that there is a net effect of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rather than adding it. So what you are actually removing is greater than what you're adding into it. And that's it in very simple terms of carbon negative. And the Carbon Trust definition for carbon neutrality has a minimum requirement of covering scope 1 and 2 emissions, with scope 3 encouraged. Okay, and net zero must cover scope 1, 2 and 3. So we do have the difference within the PAS 2060 and carbon neutrality, that scope 1 and 2 is required with scope 3 encouraged. However, to be net zero, you must cover all 3 scopes, which is scope 1, 2 and 3. Net zero, so the current definition is that the Science Based Targets Initiative has defined net zero targets for corporate as follows. To reach a state of net zero emissions for companies implies 2 conditions. To achieve a scale of value chain emission reductions consistent with the depth of abatement achieved in pathways that limit warnings to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot, and to neutralise the impact of any source of residual emissions that remains unfeasible to be eliminated by permanently removing an equivalent amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So we're always looking to see whether this is going to be a complete removal of your carbon dioxide from your organisation, and in order to become net zero. I think everybody knows the UK is looking to become net zero, and a lot of organisations have already got targets in place in order to become net zero as well. So why then carbon neutrality? To solve the problem of the man-made emissions and their effects on climate change, we need to take into account our carbon emissions and to make continued efforts to reduce them. But it is possible to reduce our carbon emissions to zero no matter what or how hard we actually try to get it to zero. And then our carbon neutrality allows the closing of this gap by purchasing carbon offsets. So for an organisation, we look at what our total carbon emissions. We will then look at reducing them, but we can never get to that fact where we are at zero. So carbon neutrality allows for purchasing carbon offsets in order to make it carbon neutral. Again, we're looking at carbon neutrality. The Earth's climate has seen many changes in its 4.5 billion years. Thankfully, I wasn't around that long ago. Sometimes I do feel it though. 18,000 years ago, most of Britain was covered in ice and glaciers. And up to now, changes in climate has been entirely neutral. The current changes that we're seeing at the moment, and I think we're probably getting a very good example of it at the moment with the current storm that's passing us, is the result of increase in human population and associated activities. So those associated activities is from the likes of increase in car emissions. We're looking at pollutants as well from factories, etc. So it's all those combinations that's actually increasing and happening to what we know as the cycle, the climate change. So there are three possible positions on climate change. I think if we speak to a lot of different people, they could have obviously some of these terms within what they classify as climate change. So some people classify it as global warming is not occurring, so neither is climate change. Some people classify it as global warming and climate change are occurring, but these are natural cyclical events unrelated to any human activity. And then obviously the third is that global warming is occurring mainly as a result of human activity. And so climate change is also the result of human activity. So that's your three elements you're always going to have within any discussion within people of how they feel about global warming and what their answer would always be. Scientists contribute the current warming trend to the use of fossil fuels because using them releases into the atmosphere stores of carbon which has been buried millions of years ago. So some of the background into the carbon is it's millions of years old. And we're extracting that as well and then burning it. The addition of this old carbon to the world's current stock of carbon is what is tipping the balance, further insulating the Earth, causing global warming and what we would know as the greenhouse effect. So more is being emitted and it is warming the Earth up because it's getting trapped within the atmosphere. Which leads on to the main culprits. Obviously, from a percentage point of view, carbon dioxide is the biggest percent. However, it is not the most toxic, as we can see, relative to the CO2. So methane, that is found from farming, natural, it is from decomposition and combustion. And what we mean here in relation to the relative to CO2, it is 30 times more harmful to the atmosphere than a CO2 is. So that's what we're meaning by the plus whenever we do that. Nitric oxide. So this is by product of the fertilizer production and use. That's 270 times. The F-gas, what we all have, or a lot of us have from air conditioning units, chillers, and that is 800 to 10,000 times depending on the type of gas that's actually used within that. And then sulfur hexafluoride, which is an insulator in high voltage applications. So we can see there it is over 22,000 times more toxic than CO2 equivalent. Okay, so the UK, they have got budgets and targets in place. We can see that by 2050, and I think it's on a lot of the headlines, it's a lot of media as well. The UK have defined that they are going to be net zero by 2050. However, they do have some interim goals in place, and it is that 30% of the public transport fleet being zero emissions by 2035. So they do have quite a bit of processes, and they also have steps in place in order to reduce and to make the pathway clear for the 2050 target of being net zero. So from sustainability and also from the carbon, we're looking at the COP26. So that was the latest one that was actually done. It was done in Glasgow, and that was the end of October into November 2021. I'm nearly forgetting what year I'm in. It was postponed for a year purely because of COVID. So they meet, the top 100 leaders meet approximately every 5 years. It is every 5 years, purely because of COVID, it was postponed a year. And their targets of what they're actually meeting is reviewed, and then to see the goal for what they're achieving then for the 2050. So UK's goal is to be net zero by 2050, and we can just see it from the chart of how they're actually getting on over from, it's looking at 2010 and where they are looking to go from in 2050. So the scale of this chart is in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's taken all of the emissions and combined them in the CO2 equivalent in metric tons. They do have a 10-point plan in order to get to net zero. The first one is looking at offshore wind. So they're quadrupling to 40 gigawatts by 2030 and supporting up to 60,000 jobs. And you can see that in a lot of different organisations as well, and certainly through universities, hence why the first two topics I'm looking at there, the offshore wind and the hydrogen coming next. Queen's University here in Belfast, that's why they were running these courses, the postgrad cert courses, is to get the education as well in behind some of the technologies that is required. So from the hydrogen point of view, there's 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production capacity by 2030. That's in the transport and the power and the homes as well. And they are going further than that, and there's a lot of communications and wording in and around that they're actually looking at green hydrogen as well. So there is a hydrogen rainbow, and green energy is obviously, as it is said, it is green, and how it's actually generated is green. They're looking at nuclear as well. So they're developing the next generation of small and advanced reactors. Electric vehicles, I think a lot of people now are starting to go to electric. So it is transforming the infrastructure to better support electric vehicles. And I think you can see that in a lot of different cities, towns, etc. The amount of charging points that is now available for electric vehicles. Public transport. So the zero emission public transport, there's cycling, there's walking schemes, etc. in a lot of different councils and cities as well. The jet zero and the greener maritime. So there's research projects into zero emission planes and ships because they are quite heavy users of fossil fuels. So they're looking to do a lot of research projects, and there is some work that's actually looking at hydrogen engines as well for ships, so that they're on a small scale at the moment, but they are actually being developed as well. Homes and public buildings. So looking to install 600,000 heat pumps every year within by 2028, and buildings to become more energy efficient. I certainly do know that there is a lot of heat pumps being installed, certainly where I live. I do live in Northern Ireland, as I did say, and buildings to be more energy efficient. So we're always looking, even from architects, etc., they're always looking at our BREEAM assessments, how can they make buildings more energy efficient. Carbon capture. So it is to target to remove 10 metric tons of carbon dioxide by 2030. Nature is restoring our natural environment and planting 30,000 hectares of trees every year. And then innovation and finance. So we're looking at the cutting edge technologies needed to reach these new energy ambitions and green finance and green investment. So we are starting to see that coming through, especially at the moment, and the focus on green energy and the finance that is available as well, coming down from the government. So that's just an overview of the 10-point plan that the UK have to get to net zero by 2050. Going forward, we are at a very important point within it. We have 2050, we're now currently in 2022, and they do know that they do need to get to net zero by 2050. So the government's industry and the civil society are coming together to take climate action. There is a growing global consensus around the zero carbon future. And to achieve the Paris goals, they must have global emissions over the next decade and basically come to rapidly adapt to our warming climate. To do that, we must all move faster. It won't happen overnight. We're now, as I said, in 2022, we have to be by net zero by 2050, and the UK do have interim goals. So immediate and decisive action is needed to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change and to create opportunities in low carbon technologies. So it's looking at all the different techniques, opportunities, etc., and technology that is there, and developing that in order to make it low carbon. Greenwashing. Greenwashing is an attempt to capitalise on growing demand for environmentally sound products. Again, it can convey a false impression that a company or its products are environmentally sound, and genuinely green products back up their claims with facts and details. Now, you will see a lot of products that may do a lot of claims that they may be carbon neutral, but may have nothing to stand up in behind it. So we're always looking to see how can we state that we are genuinely green products or service we are providing. And in order to do that, PAS 2060. So it is a specification for the demonstration of carbon neutrality. It specifies the requirements to be met by any entity, and I will explain, I think, in the next slide or two what an entity is, seeking to demonstrate carbon neutrality through the quantification, the reduction and offsetting of greenhouse gas emissions from a uniquely identified subject. It came into effect in April 2010 and it was reissued in 2014. So the latest version is the PAS 2060 2014 standard. So we will explain in relation to what an entity is, the quantification. We also will explain what a reduction and the offsetting, and looking at your greenhouse gas emissions as well. The benefits of it is to demonstrate you have got environmental integrity. It can provide a very clear and credible message to instill customer focus in your environmental messages. Also, we would have from a lot of their higher up customers may state that they're looking for their suppliers as well to be able to show carbon neutral. So we do see a lot in relation to some of our clients that we have been chatting to, and also some that have and can now claim that they're carbon neutral, that their clients themselves have been wanting them to go for carbon neutrality. And that is, it's meeting an increasing customer demand for environmentally products and services. It's to engage and motivate their staff and their stakeholders to reduce costs through operational and behavioural changes, which is quite a big area whenever we actually look at the standard and all of the areas that it would maybe focus in on as part of your emissions. And it differentiates their business from the competition, which is quite a big area. It's always nice to be able to claim if an organisation or a business is carbon neutral, or if it's a specific product, etc. So it's quite a big marketing focus and exercise as well, and so a lot of key areas come as well that they have that advantage over any competitor. So there's 4 basic elements in relation to the PAS 2060 standard. So the first one is you measure, then you reduce, then you offset, and then you document and you validate what you have done. So your first one is in relation to you measure. So you're going to measure all of your greenhouse gases and then get your total carbon footprint, whether that be for your organisation, whether that be for your product, etc. Then you put a plan in place of how you're going to reduce it, and that is your plan for going forward, and that is within your carbon management plan. Your third element is what you have and what you have then reduced it by. The residual you can offset, so there is different offset schemes you can actually purchase offsets, carbon offsets from. And the last element is you document and you validate it. So you've got a QES, or a qualifying explanatory statement, and you document what you've done, how you've done it, and it's all detailed within that. So there is only 4 stages within the PAS 2060 standard in order to specify your carbon neutrality and to go for it. Within your document and your validate, you do document your status of your carbon neutrality. There's very specific details within the PAS 2060 standard in relation to your carbon neutrality statement and what you're allowed to declare. But it's very detailed within the PAS 2060 standard. Entity. So an entity is a determination of your subject. So you uniquely identify yourself. You identify the subject of the declaration of the carbon neutrality. You establish all your characteristics of what, how you're going to do, and you establish and take into consideration all activities material to the fulfillment, achievement, and delivery of that subject. So what that means is you're looking at who you are, where you are going to do it, if it's a site specific or if it's multiple sites. You're also going to look at what all you're going to be involved. So we've got our scope 1 and 2, and then we're going to take into consideration if there is any scope 3 is going to be taken into the carbon neutrality as well, into your total carbon footprint. So I was looking to definitely see scope 1 and 2, and looking to see if your boundary is going to include scope 3 as well. So entities can include the public sector, it can be communities, it can be organisations, it can be companies as a group or a part of, it can be either a club or a social groups, it can be a family, or it can be an individual. So as you can see, an entity can be such a broad range of anything that's involved. Your scope as well is a specific activity. It can be products or a product. It can be services. It can be a building. It can be a project, or if you have a major development, So if you're in construction and you're just looking at doing it for a project or a development you're currently at, it can be an event. So an event could be a concert, and it can be in all developments as well. So it can be something that's very specific to your organization. So you can see how such a broad range from entities and scope that the PAS 2060 can actually be applied to. Such a broad range and different types of organizations and different types of products and services, etc., have and can develop and take the PAS 2060 standard and implement it within different organizations or sectors as well. So the measurement, so the starting point is to calculate what your actual carbon footprint is for what your entity is. So the recommended methodologies it's the ISO 14064-1 standard. And we've also got the greenhouse gas protocol. We have got the national government environmental reporting protocols. So like anybody would be quite used to, if we nearly done a Google search on this, you will come up and you will see the UK conversion factors in place. We've also got the PAS 2050, so that's the specification for products and services. So it's quite specific for the assessment of the life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions purely for goods and services. So our footprint measurements is that a minimum of 95% of our total calculated emissions must be accounted for, and we are able to exclude emissions that constitute less than 1% of the total. However, whenever we're doing our calculations, if one single source is above 50%, the remaining 95% applies to all other sources of emissions. Scope 1 is known as direct emissions, which are owned and controlled sources. So for an organisation, Scope 1 is anything we have control and we own. So the likes of if you own company vehicles, your boilers you do own. So that's an example of Scope 1. Scope 2 emissions is indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating or cooling, depending on your organisation. Primarily here in the UK, it would be electricity, but depends, different organisations may add in the likes of steam, heating or cooling as well. And Scope 3 has all other indirect emissions. So they're anything in the organisation's value chain, so the likes of waste, purchasing, business travel, employee commuting as well is within our Scope 3. So I have developed this, it's a lot more graphical and I think a little bit easier as well, just to be able to define our scopes. So our Scope 1 there, we can see is all direct. So fuel combustion from the boilers we would own, any furnaces, turbines, company owned vehicles. So anything, if anybody is fortunate enough to work in an organisation that is an airplane or trains or ships, but cars and trucks. It also looks at process emissions, so any cement, aluminium waste processing from any process emissions, and also Scope 1 includes fugitive emissions. So that is air conditioning, refrigeration leaks, any methane leaks from any pipelines, etc. So they're all Scope 1 and they're all direct emissions. As we can see, Scope 2 is a little bit easier. It is for the consumption of your purchased electricity, heat, steam or cooling, depending on your different organisations and what you actually have. And then our Scope 3. So Scope 3 is looking at our purchased materials, any fuels that we may purchase, transport related activities, so the likes of any employee travel, any business travel, distribution as well. It also looks at waste disposal, any leased assets. So if we think of we do any hire cars, etc., they're all coming under our scope 3, and then the use of any goods and services, so any hotel stays for business travel, the maintenance of any equipment as well on site, that's all detailed within scope 3 emissions. So I think it's quite a good overview and graphical representation of the different scopes, and I just found it a little bit easier because I'm just more graphical to be able to see it straight at hand. So to reduce, so we must within our carbon management plan, it is to plan to reduce our emissions that we have identified. So our first step is to look at all our carbon emissions, get our total carbon footprint for our organisation. Our second phase then is to look at our carbon management plan. How are we going to reduce our total carbon footprint for our organisation? So the public commitment is to carbon neutrality. We have to have a time scale of achieving our carbon neutrality. So we must define how we're going to reduce it, what we're going to reduce it by, and that's looking at our targets of greenhouse gas reductions and timescales involved in it. We also have to have a means of achieving and maintaining our greenhouse gas reductions, so justifications for any techniques and measures to be used. The time period again for any historic reductions are calculated over, and that of a constant methodology to be used, and the offsetting strategy to be used, including an estimate of quantity required. So at this point, whenever we're looking at our carbon management plan, we're estimating the quantity of offsets we're actually going to purchase. This carbon management plan, it's very specific within the PAS 2060. It must be updated, obviously reviewed and updated on an annual basis. So they do specify every 12 months it must be updated. Offset. So I have seen a question coming in relation to offsets. So PAS 2060 requires the total amount of carbon emissions at the end of your reduction period to be offset. And they do require, and they do specify within the standard, that certified carbon credits which meet the following criteria. So from one of the PAS 2060 approved schemes, so these schemes are the Clean Development Mechanism, there's the Joint Implementation, the Gold Standard, the Voluntary Carbon Standard, that they're genuinely additional. So these reductions would not have happened anyway. That's what we're always looking to see. They are verified by an independent third party to ensure that the emission reductions are permanent. They avoid leakage. And leakage is so that emissions are not increased in another area as a result of their project reductions and are not double counted. And they are retired after a maximum of 12 months from the registry. So what we've got at this stage, we have our total carbon footprint for our organisation. We've developed our carbon management plan, so we know what we're going to reduce it by, and then we're looking at our offsets. So our offsets is within the PAS 2060 standard. We are allowed to offset for the first year only 100%. After that, then we're looking at a reduction, and any that we're not able to fully reduce it by to get it to zero, we're allowed to still offset the remaining amount, but we must see reductions as well. So the different approved offset schemes, so there's different, which is detailed within the PAS 2060 standard. There is the Clean Development Mechanism, and there's the Joint Implementation, so it's emission reduction units, there's the EU alliances, then there's the Gold Standard, the Voluntary Carbon Standard, and the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standard. There's a Woodland Carbon Code, there's the WWF Gold Standard and the Verified Carbon Standard. any of these, if we put into our Google the gold standard or the verified or the voluntary carbon standard, we can go in and actually look at offset schemes that there is available and available to purchase. They are all different prices, etc. And it all depends on your organisation and what you're going to offset into different schemes, etc. So you can go into any of those online and just see the different offset schemes that there is available within each of those certified schemes that there is. So we're looking at the typical quantities needed. So the average emissions from one person in the UK, 6.5 tonnes. One person in the USA is 16.5 tonnes of CO2, and one person in the EU is 6.4 tonnes. A return flight from New York to London in economy is 1.7 tonnes, and the same flight in business class is 5 tonnes. I was recently doing a training course on PAS 2060, and we were looking at business flights, and somebody had said to me, why is the difference in business class as opposed to economy class? And it's very, very simple. He said it's the same plane, it's going the same speed, etc. The difference is there's more people in economy than there is in business. So proportionately, that one person is taking up a lot more CO2 than the amount of people that's in economy. And that's the difference with the tonnes there of CO2. And we're looking then at the different office buildings as well. So we can see there from even 1,000 metres squared of a building, 500 to 1,000 tonnes of CO2, 10,000 metres squared again, we can see 5,000 to 10,000. And then from an office space of 100 employees is 50 to 100 tonnes of CO2. We can just see the different typical quantities again of CO2 for the different areas. Okay, so the final stage then of the process is to document, to verify, and your declaration of carbon neutrality. And the requirement comes in and is supported by what I've said before. I think a lot of people just simplify this to a QES. It is the qualifying explanatory statement. Within your qualifying explanatory statement, you state, it's very detailed within the PAS 2060 standard, but a little bit of a brief overview of your QES. You detail your organisation, you detail who the most senior representative is and they are signing it, dating it, etc. The people that is organising and looking at documenting your greenhouse gas emissions. And it does your scopes, it does your boundaries as well within your organisation, and that's all detailed, but it is very detailed within the PAS 2060 standard of what exactly needs to go into your qualifying explanatory statement. The standard does require public disclosure of all documentation supporting the carbon neutrality statement, and this in practice includes the proof of your emissions reductions, the withdrawal of offsetting credits, your carbon footprint report, carbon management plan, and your QES. So within your carbon offsetting, you will see a retirement certificate for any offsets you have purchased. So they're all detailed within your QES as well. So the requirement to provide all of this information is fundamental to the final validation of the carbon neutrality statement. So it's a combination of all of this within your document in order to be able to validate and to verify your carbon neutrality statement. So there's 3 different methods for validation. So you can have a self-validation, which is for, we would say, a lot of maybe larger organization going self-validation. You can have validation from a non-accredited organisation, and then you can have independent third-party validation. So NQA do offer independent third-party validation for it, as like I said at the very start, and one of the lead verifiers for the standard and just one within NQA. So there is a team of us within NQA doing the independent third-party validation. And that process is a pre-verification, where we come into an organisation, get an overview, etc. You have your verification stage, and then we have a post-verification stage. And at that stage, after your post-verification, and they are successful, etc., and then the claims can be fully made as well. So a couple of tips for achieving carbon neutrality. Seek accreditation. So there is certification from external bodies which booster credibility within the industry. Make the most of technology as well that's out there. Looking to see where you can find where the carbon is and any technology solutions that might be able or possible to mitigate it for. Leadership. So I think this is key in all areas of all standards, and certainly whenever the standards changed, both the 9 and the 14 to the 2015 standard, leadership. So it's embedded within the change in order to make it successful for complete buy-in and the visible support from the senior leaders, and hence why we would see and the requirement within the PAS 2060 standard that the QES is being supported, signed and dated by a senior representative of the organisation. So we're seeing that as well within the PAS 2060 standard as well. Share responsibility across the company. The training course I take, I would always say it is not one single person within an organisation that is responsible for looking at your total carbon footprint. There's so many different people that is and does contribute in order, especially to obtain your total carbon footprint for your organisation, because we're looking at data sources. So we're looking at our information we're gaining and gathering within our organisation. So they may be the likes of invoicing, bills, meter readings, just some examples. If we think of business travel, we're looking to see who books flights. So it's not just one employee. It could be a wide range of different people within within your organisation. Again, to look at other organisations as well, ask suppliers, any partners on how you can reduce your carbon footprint. So if you have got suppliers from a transport point of view, etc., so it's working together in order to look at your carbon footprint. And then set science-based targets. So make sure that you're playing in the fair part in cutting your carbon footprint within your organisation in order to reach the global goal to obtaining net zero emissions. So we're, as the do say, we're in this together. We have our target of 2050 in order to become net zero, and you know, whether that be within the full of the UK, will have to be net zero by 2050. Some people have different ways and different mechanisms within the different regions of how they're going to achieve it, but that's still the overall UK goal, is to be net zero by the 2050. So there is a number of different steps that we can do and different organisations can do. So one of them, as I have already alluded to, I do train for the PAS 2060, looking at the understanding and achieving of carbon neutrality. It is a 2-day course. It gives a lot of different information into what is carbon, how it comes about. It gives an overview as well from an understanding of where we're coming from and why greenhouse gas emissions is important. But then it gets into looking at a detailed example, and we look at, within that course, we do a working example as the team does together. They look at getting their total carbon footprint for a specific organisation. Within the example, they develop a carbon management plan, and they also develop their qualifying explanatory statement. And then we look at offsetting schemes, etc., as well within that 2-day course. So it's very much a hands-on course in different sectors. And what I would always say, if you're coming to a course, bring in any elements within your organisation, and just to make it more usable and friendly as well, that you get an understanding of what it can be for your organisation. So now we have any questions and answers. Now I do see quite a bit of questions has been popping up here, and what we will do is I'll run through some of them. I know we are a little bit tight in time here, so what we will, I'll run through some of the questions. If there is any that hasn't been answered, we will look at them at a question and answer blog that will be sent out through the team, and a copy obviously of this will be looked at in relation to the whenever the guys are sending it out as well. So one of the questions is looking at going back to the 4-stage approach technically, the entity, reduce, then your footprint, offset. Sorry, I still have a lot more questions coming in, so I'm still trying to read them here at the time. And so what we're looking at from this one is our 4-stage is we're looking to measure what our total carbon footprint is for our organisation. This is was our very first year that we're doing it, so we're looking to measure it. Then we're looking to develop our carbon management plan. Then we're looking to offset from that, and then we're looking to do our validate and to document what we're actually doing. Then a year after that, we're still looking to see what our total carbon footprint is of the organisation, looking to see what reductions we have made. Then we're looking for that residual to be offset, and again updating our carbon management plan with any further reductions we're looking at, and also validating and documenting exactly what we have done again. Somebody has pointed out that Scotland has a different target. Scotland is very much well ahead, and it is a target to be net zero by 2045 and not the 2050, which the UK as a whole. Yes, I will definitely say the Scottish Government is definitely ahead. If only Northern Ireland would agree. We still are waiting on a carbon management plan from Northern Ireland, but that's a completely different story. So yes, the Scottish Government is very much ahead within it. Just looking at a couple more questions here. Somebody's just asked in relation to the cost within NQA. Unfortunately, I don't deal with costs. However, I'm sure one of the team will look at that and will be able to get back to you on any costs. I just do the audits, and I also do the verification, and I also do the training elements, so I don't get involved at all in any costs. Looking just at a couple more questions. Yeah, so we have one here. What about business growth? Sometimes we inherit carbon assets from businesses we buy, of course. So looking at that can be separated out if there's new businesses, and they can be different sites. So you can look at what your scope and your boundary is as well for the organisation. So anything you could have added on it, a new site, etc. So it's looking at what your scope and your boundary is, and to be very clear and very, it obviously has to be very well documented, the difference in relation to all of your boundaries and what you're including and not including as well, and that includes different sites as well. So different ways to look at what's involved within your organisation as well. So scope 3, one of the questions is, scope 3, does it include the carbon footprint of the organisation's supply chain or just the purchased materials. It can be both, or it can be just your purchased materials. It has to be very clear within your boundaries of what in the PAS 2060, so you can have boundaries within that which can include it, or you don't include it, so you have decided to exclude it for different reasons. So it all depends. It can be included or excluded. It depends on what you have defined as your boundary for your organisation and what you're looking for your carbon neutrality for. I think I'll just take that one last one. So I have another one here for scope 3. I think there's always questions over scope 3. So scope 3, does it include employees' total carbon footprint or just the activities associated with the organisation? It only includes the associated activities with your organisation for employees. So the likes of employee commuting is included within your scope 3. However, if they live, the employee's individual total carbon footprint isn't included within your organisation, only employee commuting is. There was a question in relation to what do we mean by offsets. So hopefully it has been explained. An offset is different offset schemes. So they could be developing. We go on to the gold standard, or if you go on to the verified standard as well, there is within that different schemes. So they could be developing wells. They could be developing wind power in different types of schemes. They could be planting trees in different areas. So it's really in relation to the SDGs. And I know I'm getting into a slightly different topic, associated topic, okay, with it. So different SDGs are associated with different offset schemes. So we could have one looking at poverty. So it is, but it's all detailed within our offset schemes. Okay, I think that is it. I know our time is up at the moment. If there is obviously there is a lot more questions in there that we have. I can see it calculating. I've seen one here about home. So how are the emissions for working at home calculated? They're under scope 3. Are they scope 1 emissions? They have to be considered in the emissions. So yeah, no, people working at home is part of scope 3 emissions. Just to answer your question in there, Christian. Okay, so our time is up. Any other questions? There's a lot of questions has actually come in there. So we will do a question and answer blog with some answers to them. Maybe could be later on next week. I think I'll enjoy my weekend now. And I would like to thank everybody for attending, and I hope you found it enjoyable. And if you do need to contact NQA, there is further information and obviously further training, like I did say, which is a lot more details on the 2-day training course in relation to PAS 20. So thank you everybody for your time, and I hope everybody enjoys the Friday afternoon and the weekend. Thank you.